The Galactic Empire had stood for millennia. Its banners hung over 1,000 conquered worlds, its armies numbered in the billions, and its methods of control were etched into the minds of every subject species. Fear was its greatest weapon, and executions were the sharpened edge of that fear. Whenever a race resisted, the Empire responded with public demonstrations of punishment so brutal and merciless that no one could mistake the lesson. Resistance meant annihilation. Defiance meant spectacle. The Empire did not merely kill those who opposed it. It broke them, displayed their broken forms, and reminded all who watched what power truly was. On the capital world of Alvaras, preparations were underway for yet another display. This one was meant to be especially meaningful, for it was not just rebels who had been captured, but humans. To the wider galaxy, humanity was still an anomaly, new arrivals who had expanded rapidly and fought ferociously on the frontier. The Empire had underestimated them once, losing entire cohorts to unexpected tactics and stubborn resistance. This time, the lesson would be different. This time, the Empire would show the galaxy that even deathworlders could be brought to heel, that even humans could be made to hang like livestock. 50 human women had been dragged in chains across half the sector, captured during a raid on a remote outpost where they had refused to surrender. Their defiance had cost the Empire dearly in time, ships, and lives, and that was precisely why they had been chosen. The order had come from the Emperor himself. Execute them in the capital's Grand Plaza, make the galaxy watch, and ensure that humanity's reputation was buried beneath the weight of fear. The plaza was prepared days in advance. Engineers erected the massive execution platform, high enough for the gathered crowd of tens of thousands to see. Imperial banners draped from the walls, their black and crimson colors stark against the gray stone. Security forces lined the streets, heavily armed, prepared not only to maintain order, but also to ensure that none of the condemned escaped. Invitations had been sent across the Empire. Governors, generals, diplomats, and representatives of allied species gathered in their ornate robes, eager to witness what they believed would be a historic moment. This was to be a performance, not merely a punishment. When the prisoners were paraded into the square, there was a hush, as though the air itself held its breath. The human women walked in chains, but not one of them stumbled. They were thin from captivity, bruises visible on some of their faces, yet their backs were straight. They did not cry out, did not beg, did not look down. They walked as if the chains meant nothing, as if the jeers of the alien crowd were beneath them. This unbroken posture unsettled even the most hardened observers. Other species, when paraded before the execution block, wept openly, clung to life desperately, and wailed to their gods. These women gave no such satisfaction. Some whispered quietly to each other, their words too soft to be heard over the clamor, but their expressions never wavered. To the Empire, this only reinforced the necessity of what was about to happen. Humans had to be broken publicly, or they would continue to inspire unrest. The alien executioner was a creature of legend himself, towering, broad-shouldered, clad in armor inscribed with runes of conquest. He had been chosen precisely to emphasize the futility of human defiance. His presence alone was meant to intimidate. His record was flawless. His reputation, that of a butcher who had never once hesitated. His task was simple: 50 ropes, 50 deaths, an extinguishing of a dangerous myth. Yet even as he took his place at the platform, raising his voice to declare the sentence, the women's eyes remained fixed forward. Not one of them looked at him with fear. Some looked at him with contempt, some with pity. One or two even smiled faintly, a gesture that spread like a ripple among them until it unsettled the watching crowd. Murmurs began among the aliens gathered. What did the humans know that they did not? Why did they smile when death stood so close? The governor of the capital, an insectoid noble draped in ceremonial silks, rose to speak. His voice carried across the plaza, declaring crimes of condemned, rebellion, resistance, murder of imperial soldiers, defiance against the emperor himself. He spoke of order, of the Empire's mercy, of the necessity of obedience. He spoke as if to reassure the crowd, but he was really speaking to history, to the records that would immortalize this moment. He wanted it remembered that humanities will have been broken here, today, by the might of the Empire. But the humans did not play their role. They did not grovel. They did not cry. They stood tall, shoulders squared, faces unflinching. The governor's speech began to falter under the weight of their silence. He raised his voice, trying to drown out the unease that spread through the crowd, but the image of 50 chained women, refusing to submit, would not leave the minds of those who watched. At last the time came. The executioner raised his hand, signaling the beginning of the final act. The nooses were lowered, ropes dangling ominously in the light. Soldiers forced the humans into position, fitting the rough cords around their necks. Still, they did not resist, though their defiance radiated like a fire that could not be extinguished. Some of them whispered final words, not prayers, not pleas, but words of solidarity, of promise, of vengeance. One voice carried above the rest, a firm declaration that froze even some of the guards. You can kill us, but you will never end us. The Empire believed it held complete control. Every step had been rehearsed, every contingency accounted for. The plaza was filled with soldiers, sharpshooters perched on the walls. Scanners acted to detect hidden weapons or intruders. Nothing was left to chance. This was supposed to be flawless. Yet beneath that polished facade, cracks were already forming. The very silence of the condemned was a crack. The whispers spreading through the audience were cracks. The doubt in the soldiers' eyes as they looked at the humans standing unbowed was another. The executioner grasped the ceremonial blade that would cut the signal cord, the stroke that would drop the platform floor and tighten the ropes. He raised it high, basking the cheers of the crowd that expected to see death. The alien nobility leaned forward eagerly, some smiling, others gloating. For them, this was entertainment as much as it was justice. For the Empire, it was validation. For the humans, it was something else entirely. The women's gazes did not waver. They looked not at the ropes, nor the executioner, nor the governor who had condemned them. They looked at the horizon, as if seeing something beyond the plaza, beyond the Empire itself. A few exchanged glances, silent understanding passing between them. Whatever came next, they had already decided. They would not give the Empire victory. The crowd roared as the executioner swung his blade downward. The signal cord began to snap. The nooses tightened slightly, creaking in anticipation, breath caught in thousands of throats. The spectacle reached its climax. The moment of death was at hand. The blade should have cut cleanly through the cord. It should have dropped the platform, snapping the necks of 50 human women in front of an entire empire. That was what every soldier, every noble, every subject watching through broadcast channels across 1,000 worlds expected. But what they saw instead was something that no protocol, no calculation, and no historian of conquest had ever prepared them for. As the blade descended, it froze halfway through its arc. For a heartbeat, the crowd thought it was part of the ceremony, some drawn-out flourish. Then came the wet sound of something tearing, and the massive alien executioner staggered forward. His weapon clattered to the wood. His head rolled free from his shoulders and struck the platform with a dull finality, bouncing once before tumbling to the ground below. Blood sprayed in an arc that painted the banners crimson. The body stood swaying for an instant, as if unwilling to believe it had been severed from its own life, before collapsing beside the very ropes it had been meant to pull. The silence was absolute. Tens of thousands stood frozen, the roar of the crowd strangled into stillness. Even the soldiers nearest the platform were too shocked to move. No one had seen who struck the blow. No assassin was visible. No weapon had been fired. The most feared executioner in the Empire, the man whose name had been used to terrify prisoners across 100 systems, had been killed in the very moment he was to enforce the Emperor's will. The human women did not gasp, did not recoil, did not show shock. Their eyes locked on a rolling head, and though bound by chains and ropes, they stood taller, as if some invisible weight had lifted. They did not speak, but their silence became its own decoration. In that silence, the crowd began to feel something no subject of the Empire was ever supposed to feel in such a place. Fear not the condemned, but the possibility that the condemned were not powerless after all. Soldiers rushed to the stage belatedly, weapons drawn, shouting conflicting orders. Some pointed at the crowd, searching for an infiltrator. Others shouted to cut down the prisoners immediately. But hesitation had already taken root. For centuries, the Empire's strength had not been merely its armies, but the certainty it projected. That certainty was gone in an instant. The impossible had occurred, and the minds of even the most disciplined guards could not explain it. The women were unchained from the spectacle by accident rather than mercy. The shock of the executioner's fall caused some guards to loosen their grip, others to step back, and the ropes that were meant to strangle them now hung useless, swaying in the breeze. Chains slipped, and hands that had been bound came free. For the first time in weeks, the women could flex their fingers, and the sound of iron striking wood was as loud to the crowd as the executioner's head had been when it fell. Still no one moved to strike them down. Eyes darted to the headless corpse, to the still rolling head that had stopped against the boot of a soldier who did not dare touch it. Whispers began to build like rising wind. Words hissed from one alien to another. Sorcery, curse, death world trickery. Fear rippled outward faster than reason could contain it. Then one of the women stepped forward. She stooped, not to flee, but to seize a massive weapon the executioner had dropped. It was far too heavy for a frame, designed for a creature twice her size, but she lifted it nonetheless. The sight was worse than blasphemy to the watching aliens. A human woman, who should have been nothing more than a broken example, now held in her hands the very blade meant to kill her. She raised it, blood still dripping from its edge, and leveled her gaze at the assembled soldiers. No words were needed. Her stance was enough. She was no longer a prisoner. She was an executioner in her own right. The crowd began to break. Nobles shouted for order. Governors shrieked that this was treason, that someone must act, but their voices were drowned beneath the surge of panic. Soldiers stepped backward instead of forward. None wished to be the first to test whether these women were as powerless as they seemed. Superstition clashed with training. The certainty that had always guided the Empire's enforcers evaporated in the face of something they did not understand. Then steel sang. The woman swung the executioner's blade, not at the crowd, not at her captors, but the rope still dangling across the platform. The cords that were symbols of submission were severed with one brutal strike, each rope whipping free like the lashes of a broken whip. The gesture was more powerful than if she had killed a soldier. It was rejection of the execution itself, a refusal to accept the role of victim. The other women followed, some seizing dropped weapons, others taking nothing at all, standing simply with clenched fists and unyielding eyes. Together they formed a line, facing the crowd not as condemned but as challengers. 50 women, once chained, now free, standing before tens of thousands. The governor screamed at his guards to act. But hesitation had transformed into paralysis. To strike them down now seemed dangerous in ways no alien could articulate. What if more executioners fell dead without cause? What if killing them only unleashed something worse? The myth of human unpredictability, whispered for years on the fringes of the Empire, had just been given form in front of everyone. The women advanced one step, and an entire front rank of soldiers retreated too. Their armor clattered as they backed away, discipline breaking down under the weight of uncertainty. None had been given orders for this. None had been trained for an enemy that did not fight with weapons, but with an aura of inevitability. Panic spread faster than orders could countermand it. The crowd surged against itself. The nobility tried to retreat. Commoners trying to flee, guards shouting at one another to hold the line. And in the center of it all, the women stood calm, watching as the Empire unraveled around them without a single battle cry. Finally, the silence broke. The same woman who had swung the blade spoke loudly enough for the words to cut through the chaos. She said nothing of mercy, nothing of peace. Her voice rang with promise and inevitability. You cannot kill what refuses to kneel. The phrase carried, echoed, and repeated itself across the plaza until it became a chant on alien lips, even from those too terrified to know why they said it. The first blood spilled not from a woman, but from the hands of a terrified guard who fired too soon. The bolt shot wide, striking another soldier instead of its intended target. In that instant, the Empire's perfect order shattered. Soldiers turned on each other in confusion. Some convinced traitors were among them, others sure that humans had possessed their comrades. Shouts turned to screams as allies cut down allies. The women did not need to strike first. The Empire destroyed itself in front of them. When one guard rushed forward in desperation, A woman sees him with her chain still dangling from her wrists and crushes his throat before taking his sidearm. The sight sent another ripple through the soldiers, the myth growing with every second. Weapons were seized, shots fired, blood spilled, but through it all, the women did not falter. They moved with precision born not of training, but of necessity. The Empire thought the chaos in Plaza would be a temporary embarrassment, a moment of disorder soon corrected by the full weight of its armies. Governors insisted the rebellion would be crushed before it left the city walls. Commanders swore new troops would restore order. Courtiers whispered that the broadcast feeds would be scrubbed, the truth buried beneath propaganda. But truth is never so easily contained, and what had been meant to terrify humanity into submission became the spark of something far greater. The death of the executioner and the survival of the 50 human women did not remain a local anomaly. It became a story, and stories travel faster than fleets. On the frontier, miners whispered it over comms. On occupied worlds, slaves repeated it in hushed voices when guards were gone. In military barracks, soldiers passed a rumor in disbelief, only to hear confirmed by another who had seen the footage before it was censored. The message was simple, undeniable. The Empire had failed. Not failed in battle, not failed in negotiation, but failed in its most sacred theater, public execution. That failure was worse than defeat. It meant weakness. It meant the unbreakable order was not unbreakable after all. The governor of Alvarez tried to suppress it. He ordered executions of those who spoke too loudly, purges of units that had fled, propaganda broadcast depicting humans as cowardly tricksters who relied on deceit rather than strength. Yet none of it worked. The more the Empire tried to erase the story, the more powerful it became. Alien species that had lived generations under the Empire's shadow suddenly found themselves whispering that if even humans could defy the noose, then perhaps there was hope. Perhaps the Empire was not eternal. The 50 women did not vanish into obscurity. They became symbols. Instead of fleeing, they moved from place to place like living legends. They gathered survivors, inspired resistance cells, and turned their very survival into a weapon. They did not fight openly with armies. They did not have armies. They fought with presence, with defiance, with a reminder that even when stripped of weapons and chained like cattle, humans refused to kneel. Entire settlements rose in rebellion upon hearing that the women had passed through, as if their footsteps alone could plant the seeds of courage. The Empire responded with fury. Entire garrisons were dispatched to hunt them down. Bounties were offered, immense rewards for anyone who betrayed their location. Yet, wherever the Empire moved, it found itself bleeding strength. Troops deserted. Ships sabotaged themselves from within. Governors discovered their local militias refusing to march against humans. The fear that was supposed to paralyze the galaxy had turned against its masters. It was not that the humans were invincible. Battles were still fought. Many humans still died, but death was no longer the end. Every fallen human became another verse in the legend, another martyr whose name joined the chorus of defiance. Where once executions instilled terror, now they only fueled the fire. When a human was put to death, the people who witnessed it whispered that somewhere, somehow, the 50 still walked free, carrying the memory of the dead into vengeance. The Empire's strength had always rested on perception. It ruled not only by force, but by the belief that its force was absolute, that resistance was pointless. But perception had shifted, and with it, the foundation cracked. Other species began to act in ways unthinkable only cycles before. Smugglers began delivering weapons to human enclaves. Governors secretly met with human leaders, hedging their bets against the future. Soldiers quietly disobeyed orders, letting prisoners escape, losing shipments, sabotaging supply lines. Every act of disobedience, no matter how small, was an echo of the executioner's head hitting the ground. The emperor raged, sending decree after decree, demanding extermination. Entire fleets were mobilized. Yet the more ships were sent, the more the legend spread. The Empire could not kill the story. Every attempt to erase it only carved it deeper into the galaxy's memory. For the first time in living history, the galaxy was not united in fear of the Empire, but in awe of humanity. The 50 women themselves were transformed in the eyes of others. They ceased being individuals. To many, they were saints, figures of reverence. To others, they were avengers, embodiments of deathworld wrath. Some swore they had supernatural powers. Others believed they were immortals who could not die. Even when reports came of one or two falling in later skirmishes, the story changed the claim. They had risen again elsewhere. The truth was irrelevant. Belief was what mattered, and belief was now a weapon sharper than any blade. Rebellions flared across the empire. Colonies long crushed by taxation rose in defiance. Subject species once broken by fear began to test their chains. At first these uprisings were scattered, uncoordinated, doomed to fall. But humans had a way of connecting, of adapting, of turning chaos into pattern. Soon there were networks, hidden routes of communication, caches of supplies, alliances forming across species lines that had never before trusted each other. The humans became the fulcrum of it all, uniting the fractured discontent of the galaxy into something focused. What terrified the Empire most was not simply the battles. It was how humans fought them. They turned every environment into a weapon. On jungle worlds, they melted into the foliage and struck from shadows. On desert planets, they endured heat that killed their enemies and fought long after others collapsed. On frozen moons, they moved through storms with resilience that bordered on madness. No matter the battlefield, humans adapted faster, endured longer, and struck harder than logic should have allowed. Where others faltered, humans thrived, and where others survived, humans triumphed. It became a saying whispered among alien soldiers. Do not face a human with nothing to lose. The Empire had stripped these 50 women of everything. Freedom, dignity, life itself. And still they had defied it. What, then, could the Empire hope to do against humanity when armed and unchained? One by one, the pillars of the Empire faltered. Provinces that had paid tribute for centuries stopped sending shipments. Armies that had once marched proudly began to mutiny. Governors who had been absolute rulers in their domains fled into exile, terrified of mobs who no longer feared their punishments. The emperor's decrees grew more frantic, his demand for loyalty more shrill. But every word revealed weakness. The very certainty of his throne, once unquestioned, now seemed fragile. The moment that sealed it came when alien species, long cowed into obedience, began to side openly with humanity. Some did so out of desperation, hoping to survive whatever storm was coming. But others did so out of belief. They had seen the broadcasts, heard the stories, and come to the conclusion that humans were not merely rebels. They were a force of nature, and it was wiser to stand with the storm than against it. The women themselves became myth. Songs were written of them, plays performed in secret, chants carried from world to world. Children of conquered species whisper their names as prayers before sleep rebels.